4625 kHz, endless, buzz, the mystery of UVB-76. Hello, welcome to the Address of Fear. If you love horror stories, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. If you're ready, let's get started. Year 2021, Moscow. Alexei Morozov had made staying awake until the early hours of the morning a habit. Far from the noise of Moscow, he found peace in his small apartment by drifting through shortwave frequencies. As a radio amateur for many years, exploring frequencies had become a passion. But tonight, there was something different among all the familiar frequencies. A signal, a sound, something unusual. It was past 3 a.m. Alexei, wearing headphones, was moving through several different frequencies with his old receiver when he heard something extraordinary on 4625 kHz. At first, he couldn't make sense of it. It was an almost constant, uninterrupted buzz that lasted until the first light of dawn. There was no increase or change in the signal. However, the persistence and stability of this buzz grabbed Alexei's attention. In his mind, he realized that it was one of those familiar frequencies he had heard countless times before, yet never truly paid attention to. It was the frequency of the buzzer, a radio station that had been heard since the 1970s. But its real purpose, those who controlled it, or the reason it continued broadcasting had never been clearly explained. For a long time, it had been considered just another ordinary signal. But suddenly Alexei's curiosity flared up. Something clicked within him. Why had he, as a radio amateur, never looked deeper into this station? It had been so common, so unremarkable that he had never bothered with it. But tonight, after a faint crackle, the sound that followed seemed to tell him something else. He adjusted the frequency a bit more carefully to listen more intently. Now, amidst the buzz, he noticed a subtle encrypted voice creeping through. A deep, muffled voice, like wind, but sharply resonating in his ears. Even, Operacja odmenena, povtorayu, odmenena. Alexei froze, his eyes glued to the screen. His heart started racing. He couldn't immediately recognize the language, but there was something wrong with this sentence. Operacja odmenena. The operation was cancelled. Why? Which operation? The sentence sounded like it came from a military command, but how and why was it so clear? After a moment of shock, Alexei quickly began recording the sound and typing notes on his phone. Could such a clear message on a radio frequency have been a mistake? On the contrary, everything seemed too organized. Everything appeared as it should. He quickly moved to his computer to try and decode the message, but he knew nothing about this cryptic language. Slowly, he entered a forum site and searched for UVB-76. There had been theories and speculations about the buzzer for years. Various conspiracy theorists had claimed the station could be linked to nuclear wars or covert operations, but no one had ever proven any of this to be true. Alexei couldn't bring himself to share this data so quickly. Others might not anticipate what he would do, but he knew he had to be careful. For several days, Alexei continued to listen to the 4625 kHz frequency. The sound persisted. Sometimes it was a long buzz, other times an encrypted command. With every signal, something was there. But understanding it was impossible. Alexei began to question whether these signals meant anything. No one else was. As serious a radio listener as he was simply a man following the trail of a radio signal. A week later, as he spent another night listening, when he put on his headphones and turned on the receiver, the frequency suddenly buzzed more sharply than ever before. At that moment, Alexei heard the message he had previously heard. But this time, there seemed to be something more. His ears sharpened, searching for a deeper meaning behind the sound. The word Ivan stood out so clearly that it almost echoed in Alexei's mind, but it seemed like there was someone else there too. For a moment, Alexei felt as though he were in another dimension. He placed his hand on his forehead, turned his head slightly, and examined the numbers on his device's screen. What was happening? How much meaning could there be in a radio signal? The next day, the people discussing Alexei's recorded message on the forum told him that he needed to go beyond mere indifference. There's no point in trying to solve the buzzer, they said. But for Alexei, this signal had become an obsession. He thought that such a clear message couldn't be a coincidence. He found himself chasing after another mystery. The operation had been cancelled. But which operation? Who was Ivan? That night, with 1,000 questions in his mind, the sounds Alexei had been chasing led him down a path, and that path would return to him as an obsession. Before he went to sleep, he slowly opened his computer. The sound of the buzzer still echoed in his ears. But there was something. Something was missing. What had once been an ordinary sound would turn into the biggest question of his life. Year 2021, near Leningrad. Alexei had decided to dig even deeper into the traces of the UVB-76 signal he had been following for the past few days. As he tried to decipher the disturbing commands and messages filled with children's voices that he had heard on the frequency, he realized that he had to follow something further. Everything had to have started somewhere, and this signal he was tracking was leading him to another dimension, to something he couldn't fully comprehend. One day, a piece of information he stumbled upon in an old forum pushed him into action. In 2010, rumors had circulated that the UVB-76 station had stopped broadcasting from an abandoned military base near Leningrad, but somehow the signal was still emanating from there. The only thing clear was that the area was completely abandoned. The base had suddenly been shut down one night, in a very short period of time. According to government statements, non-operational facilities had been closed, and the military personnel had been relocated elsewhere. For Alexei, everything was a new research opportunity. The mystery of this abandoned military base required him to uncover more information. So he began preparing for a few days to reach the station. Armed with only old maps, radios, and a few basic tools, there was no turning back. For Alexei, this would be a kind of final destination. On a cold, gray morning, Alexei set off for Leningrad by car. The speed of the wind and the cloudy sky created a deep sense of unease within him. The questions in his mind grew with each passing mile. If this base had truly been abandoned, then why was it so silent? Why was the UVB-76 signal still so strong? The abandoned military base was about an hour away from Leningrad, deep in the forest. There was no human sound around, just the rustling of trees and the humming of the wind. As he drove off the road and entered the forest, heading toward the station, unease began to seep into Alexei. The sharp cold of the air wrapped around him. His eyes scanned every detail of his surroundings carefully, because this was not just an abandoned place. It seemed like a time period hidden within the shadows of the past. When he arrived at the station and stepped inside, everything seemed to stop for a moment. It was as if time had frozen here. The building's old brick walls, broken windows, and earth-covered floors. Everything had been abandoned. Slowly, he moved forward, and with each step, the sense of fear in the air intensified. But he was chasing something. A secret, a clue, something pulling him deeper. The building allowed him to pass through a narrow corridor and enter. The first thing that caught his attention was the slightly open door to a room filled with old radio equipment. Nothing was missing here. Everything was in place. Rusted old tools and grounded wire connections were scattered on the table. But something caught Alexei's attention. The equipment seemed to be arranged as if it was still active. It was emitting a signal, as if something was still moving. Alexei took a step back and pressed a button on one of the devices. Immediately, a faint buzz emitted from the device. Without fully understanding what was happening, he quickly turned the device off. But there was something. That old sound, that familiar signal, now seemed to be watching him. His eyes shifted to the old manuscripts on the table. Each page contained irregular notes. The sentences were fragmented. Some pages were torn and faded. But something stood out. At the corner of one page, a note was written in red ink. When the active signal is cut off, the protocol is activated. This writing meant something to him. What protocol? Why did something activate when the signal was cut off? Alexei tried to search for more details on the page, but everything was jumbled. Suddenly, he heard a sound in his headphones. That disturbing buzz started again. The signal's cutoff was a sign that something had begun. But what? As Alexei continued recording the sounds, he was suddenly shaken by a sense of dark emptiness. Everything had changed abruptly. The coldness in the air increased, and there was an unease in the building. At that moment, he felt a movement behind him. He quickly turned around to check, but there was no one there. As hours passed, Alexei left the room without understanding what was happening. However, this departure left him with another question. When he returned to the room, everything seemed different. The working equipment, the disordered cables, and the desks filled with missing documents. This was no longer the old military base. That night, Alexei disappeared. All that was left behind was his abandoned car with an open radio and a device recording UVB-76. The recording device was still running, but nothing was being recorded. No more news was ever heard of Alexei. Year 2023, St. Petersburg. On a cold winter day in St. Petersburg, Elena Kovalchuk was working intensively in the old university library. A final-year student in the Department of Electrical Engineering, Elena had been focusing deeply on a topic she had been thinking about for a long time. She had decided to write a thesis on hidden signals, a subject with many different theories. However, what caught Elena's attention most was a long-lost radio signal and the mystery behind it. Elena enjoyed browsing old forums. One day, when she found the recording of the missing radio amateur Alexei Morozov, she realized that this recording would form the foundation of almost all her projects. She had heard about Morozov's disappearance and the mystery of the recordings he had left behind, but they had never encountered such a detailed signal recording. The frequency Alexei had found offered a search for a kind of encrypted message behind a very old radio signal. The recording was from 2021, and it was a part of the UVB-76 signal, which had been sending a constant buzzing after a long period of silence. Elena decided to delve deeper to solve Alexei's recording. The recordings were old, but with the technology available, it was possible to decode these sounds. When she got help from a sound engineer at the university who was very experienced in radio signals and frequency analysis, she became even more convinced that the solution was near. Elena uploaded the recording file to her computer. Her goal, at that moment, was to analyze the different layers behind the sound. Such frequencies often come at a pitch so low that human ears cannot hear them, but with the right equipment and software, the sublayers of these signals could be revealed. Elena focused on the signal and slowly detected the presence of a cyclical sound at a very low frequency, which was initially hard to notice. There was something behind the signal, but what was it? After hours of examination, with the help of the sound engineer, she managed to separate the low-frequency signal. Her eyes studied the fluctuations on the computer screen. Once she was sure there was no mistake, she began listening to the audio file. At first, what sounded like an ordinary murmur revealed a melody, as if a child was singing a lullaby. The melody was very old and elegantly recorded, as if it had been recorded long ago, in a much earlier time. Elena decided to go deeper into the sound and listened to the reversed version of the recording. She suddenly found herself in a disturbing atmosphere. The murmur was replaced by a frightening message. Immediately, she focused on the voice in her ears. "If you hear this sound, it's too late." Elena's heart began to race. It sounded almost like a threat. Why did this sound, the reversed version of a seemingly innocent lullaby, carry such a frightening message? What did this message mean? And the bigger question, was there a connection to the night Alexei disappeared? Elena examined every detail of the recording on her screen. This was beyond a normal signal. "If you hear this sound, it's too late." Could this sentence be a past mistake or an abandoned warning? Elena thought about the fact that the signal aligned with the time of Alexei's disappearance. Could this be a kind of encrypted message? And was the phrase "too late" some kind of time warning? She knew she needed to do more research to understand this. But everything was so complicated that she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For a week, Elena continued to work on the recording. This time, she asked the sound engineer to analyze the recording more deeply. She tried to learn more about the structure and pattern beneath the signal. However, something was missing. No matter how much she researched, it was incredibly difficult to figure out the exact purpose behind the recording. Like many radio signals, it was a carrier of communication, but from whom? Who would use such a complex encryption technique? The interesting part was that the content of the recording matched exactly with the night Alexei had disappeared. It was as if that signal was a kind of warning. As all these clues and mysteries started to come together, something began to become clearer in Elena's mind. The unexpected interruption in 2010, followed by these terrifying messages. It was as if something was supposed to be triggered. But what? With a determination to unravel the meaning behind the recording, Elena began to think about visiting the locations from the day Alexei disappeared. However, something told her that the sound that once came from here represented much more than she had imagined. To solve everything, she just needed the right key. And that key perhaps was very close, but still in a place that would remain unsolvable. Year 2023, St. Petersburg. Elena Kovalchuk had become increasingly obsessed with solving the mystery of UVB-76. Over the past few weeks, as she examined the recordings of the missing radio amateur Alexei, the layers of secrets were unfolding one by one. Indeed, UVB-76's broadcasts were not just a means of communication, but a source of encrypted messages. She sensed there was something much deeper, but unfortunately these discoveries were pulling her into a more dangerous place. One morning, when she woke up, the sun had not yet risen. The cold winter mornings of St. Petersburg often drove people into deep unease, but this morning felt different. As she moved towards her room, the electricity went out. Only the emergency lights, a few old books by the window, and a map hanging on the wall cast a faint, flickering light in Elena's small apartment. The coldness in the air was increasing as well. She felt that something was wrong, but she couldn't yet figure out what it was. Everything happened suddenly. When the power went out, the screen on her computer went black. She immediately pulled her phone out of her pocket, but there was no signal. At that moment, there was no way to communicate. With a deep sigh, she turned back to her computer, thinking she might open the old recording again. But there was something. The atmosphere in the room had changed. It felt like something was becoming tense. She glanced around but thought nothing was there. Still, while observing the emptiness, she noticed something move. Suddenly she heard sounds coming from the door. Soft steps, like the size of 2 thumbs, followed by quick knocks on the door. Elena immediately locked her door, but it was too late. The door was suddenly forced open. 2 men entered silently. Their faces weren't fully visible in the dark, but both of them were moving quickly. One had gloves on, and the other was holding some kind of carrying bag. Without making a sound, Elena watched as the men immediately moved toward her computer. Whatever had happened, these men were after only one thing: the computer. Without saying a word, the men sat down at the computer and began pressing keys rapidly. Elena's protests were in vain. They were moving so quickly that in just a few seconds they took control of her computer. Without saying anything, they locked her door and left the apartment. Everything had happened so fast that she couldn't fully understand what had just occurred. As she watched them leave, a silence fell over the apartment, but a sense of unease and fear lingered. The electricity came back after a while, but everything in the room remained the same. The computer screen was dark and the software had closed. Elena thought about the fact that the signal aligned with the time of Alexei's disappearance. Could this be a kind of encrypted message? And was the phrase "too late" some kind of time warning? She knew she needed to do more research to understand this. But everything was so complicated that she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. For a week, Elena continued to work on the recording. This time, she asked the sound engineer to analyze the recording more deeply. She tried to learn more about the structure and pattern beneath the signal. However, something was missing. No matter how much she researched, it was incredibly difficult to figure out the exact purpose behind the recording. Like many radio signals, it was a carrier of communication, but from whom? Who would use such a complex encryption technique? The interesting part was that the content of the recording matched exactly with the night Alexei had disappeared. It was as if that signal was a kind of warning. As all these clues and mysteries started to come together, something began to become clearer in Elena's mind. The unexpected interruption in 2010, followed by these terrifying messages. It was as if something was supposed to be triggered. But what? With a determination to unravel the meaning behind the recording, Elena began to think about visiting the locations from the day Alexei disappeared. However, something told her that the sound that once came from here represented much more than she had imagined. To solve everything, she just needed the right key. And that key perhaps was very close, but still in a place that would remain unsolvable. Year 2023, St. Petersburg. Elena Kovalchuk had become increasingly obsessed with solving the mystery of UVB-76. Over the past few weeks, as she examined the recordings of the missing radio amateur Alexei, the layers of secrets were unfolding one by one. Indeed, UVB-76's broadcasts were not just a means of communication, but a source of encrypted messages. She sensed there was something much deeper, but unfortunately these discoveries were pulling her into a more dangerous place. One morning, when she woke up, the sun had not yet risen. The cold winter mornings of St. Petersburg often drove people into deep unease, but this morning felt different. As she moved towards her room, the electricity went out. Only the emergency lights, a few old books by the window, and a map hanging on the wall cast a faint, flickering light in Elena's small apartment. The coldness in the air was increasing as well. She felt that something was wrong, but she couldn't yet figure out what it was. Everything happened suddenly. When the power went out, the screen on her computer went black. She immediately pulled her phone out of her pocket, but there was no signal. At that moment, there was no way to communicate. With a deep sigh, she turned back to her computer, thinking she might open the old recording again. But there was something. The atmosphere in the room had changed. It felt like something was becoming tense. She glanced around but thought nothing was there. Still, while observing the emptiness, she noticed something move. Suddenly she heard sounds coming from the door, soft steps, like the size of two thumbs, followed by quick knocks on the door. Elena immediately locked her door, but it was too late. The door was suddenly forced open. Two men entered silently. Their faces weren't fully visible in the dark, but both of them were moving quickly. One had gloves on, and the other was holding some kind of carrying bag. Without making a sound, Elena watched as the men immediately moved toward her computer. Whatever had happened, these men were after only one thing: the computer. Without saying a word, the men sat down at the computer and began pressing keys rapidly. Elena's protests were in vain. They were moving so quickly that in just a few seconds they took control of her computer. Without saying anything, they locked her door and left the apartment. Everything had happened so fast that she couldn't fully understand what had just occurred. As she watched them leave, a silence fell over the apartment, but a sense of unease and fear lingered. The electricity came back after a while, but everything in the room remained the same. The computer screen was dark and the software had closed. In other words, UVB-76 wasn't just a communication tool, it was an alarm system and a precursor to a globally terrifying event. This information changed Victor's life. However, he also knew that sharing this knowledge with the rest of the world was incredibly dangerous. One of Russia's greatest secrets had been hidden for years, and revealing it could mean nothing less than treason. But Victor now wanted to make a difference. Years after the end of the Cold War, living in the middle of an unknown world, he realized that the secrets he held could become a danger large enough to change the fate of a nation. Victor decided to contact a journalist and leak the documents he had. He knew that only the right hands should receive these files. However, as time passed, this dangerous game would cost him dearly. One morning, as he was preparing to deliver the files and information to the journalist, a deep darkness engulfed Victor. His heart began to ache intensely, and he had difficulty breathing. As his vision blurred, he couldn't tell if the beam of light entering his room was just a hallucination or another existential fear. Viktor Lebedev died alone in his small forest cabin in northern Russia. Now, those investigating his death believed it to be a natural passing. However, after Viktor's death, not a single person questioned it. The police, without any suspicion or autopsy, concluded that it had been a natural end. However, the UVB-76 files had vanished. Viktor's notes and documents had somehow disappeared. These files, which vanished without a trace, remained hidden, as a question mark in the minds of those who survived. As Elena's investigation continued, everything seemed to converge. The mysteries of UVB-76 and UVB-76 represented something far more significant than the buzzing of a mere radio station. Would these secrets ever be revealed? Were Viktor's revelations messages from another time, a great secret that needed to be carried in this world? The unknown secrets within time still awaited discovery after Viktor Lebedev's death. And perhaps, one day, those who listened to UVB-76 would understand what this signal truly represented. The frequency 4625 kHz had echoed in the ears of listeners for years. The buzzer, or UVB-76, had broadcast its same monotonous hum, day and night, for weeks, months, and years without interruption. Occasionally, strange messages, encrypted military commands, or cryptic announcements would come through, keeping listeners on edge. Many theories existed. Some believed it was a spy network. Others thought it was part of the abandoned Soviet nuclear deterrence system. But the most widely accepted theory was that UVB-76 was a kind of encrypted warning system. If the broadcast stopped, something was terribly wrong. By 2025, the station's sound was more determined than ever. Something caught everyone's attention. Suddenly, the 4625 kHz frequency went silent. There was no eerie hum, no usual command sounds. Shortwave listeners around the world began to panic. Forums erupted with questions. Has the trigger been initiated? Has the system failed? Or is something really happening and we just don't know it? Many amateur radio listeners searched the frequency for hours, but each attempt resulted in nothing but deep silence. As hours passed, this strange silence, spreading to more people, unsettled them even more. The uncertainty continued into the late hours of the night. A fear gripped everyone. Was this the first step towards the end of the world? Did the silence mean everything was over? However, a few days later, something unexpected happened. The silence was suddenly broken. One morning, as listeners around the world tried to tune into 4625 kHz again, they heard something far more terrifying than they could have anticipated. It was so clear that for a moment, everyone froze, holding their breath. The hum returned, seemingly with its old rhythm. But there was a difference. This time, a child's voice was heard, crystal clear. "The protocol has been restarted," the child's voice said, in a faint but distinct tone. Every word seemed to carry a certain clarity, and there was more behind it. It felt like the announcement of an impending catastrophe. Though it lasted only a few seconds, that moment created a sudden sense that everything had changed. Listeners were stunned, unable to believe their ears. After the silence, this sentence reminded them of a time when people began to ask themselves, "The protocol has been restarted." After this short but powerful message, the hum resumed. But it wasn't the same as before. The rhythm had changed, much faster and more erratic. The old buzzer sound was quickly turning into an echoing, distorted version. The sudden change in UVB-76's transmission sent waves of panic and speculation throughout the world. Amateur radio listeners, now more vigilant than ever, began recording everything and sharing their findings. Discussions flooded forums and social media, each person trying to make sense of the cryptic message. The question was simple, yet terrifying. Had the trigger protocol been initiated? Old documents, the missing files, and Viktor Lebedev's leaked information from before his death all seemed to be converging. The writings about the trigger protocols had referenced the signal loss and the subsequent restart sequence, which were tied to the highly classified and long-hidden details of the system. This wasn't just a random broadcast disruption. It was something far more alarming. Many conspiracy theorists began suggesting that the incident could be a precursor to a nuclear strike. Rumors about the dead hand system, the automated Soviet retaliation mechanism, had long been circulating, and now the change in the UVB-76 broadcast seemed to align with those predictions. The idea that the system had been active all along, ready to trigger catastrophic consequences, gained traction rapidly. Yet no one had definitive proof of such a secret military operation in motion. The only tangible evidence was the chilling shift in the broadcast itself, an unmistakable signal to those listening, a warning. Every morning, amateur radio enthusiasts resumed their vigil, tuning into 4625 kHz, hoping for some clarity. Yet, no new messages came. No developments followed. Even though rumors of the dead hand system had circulated widely in the previous weeks, today, the situation remained a mystery. Something was clearly different, but the true nature of what was unfolding was still out of reach. As time passed, the uncertainty deepened. Was this silence just the beginning of something greater? Or was it truly the herald of an impending end? Many listeners, some even convinced that the short but unsettling phrase carried with it a world-altering secret, found themselves grappling with the enormity of the situation. The idea that this simple, eerie announcement, the protocol has been restarted, was the key to unraveling a much larger, far darker truth loomed over them. But what would it take to fully uncover that truth? What would unravel when the secrets behind UVB-76, Iskra-76, and the dead hand system were fully exposed? The stakes were high, and the chilling possibility that the answers could lead to an unimaginable catastrophe left everyone on edge. With the world hanging in the balance, the question remained, was it already too late to stop the chain of events that had been set in motion?